Okay, in the second part, we'll focus on some of the kind of computational ideas around problem-solving strategies. So if we're going to use particular heuristics or algorithms to solve problems, what are these and what are some of the limitations with them? So the real kind of beginning of the study of problem-solving began in the Gestalt era. So this was originally work by Carl Duncker, who we'll come across in a minute, who did some work on functional fixedness, who published a textbook in German. And this basically started to outline a general description of what problems are, what kind of components they comprised of, what was the importance of representing problems in particular ways. More recently, so this is still back in the 1970s with the emergence of the sort of cognitive revolution. We had work that was done by Newell and Herbert Simon, who basically tried to approach the concept of problem solving from a computational or artificial intelligence way. So they were really interested in if you were, for example, designing a computer algorithm in order to solve a problem, what are the kind of commands that you would instruct this program to do in order to reach its solutions? And as part of this, they defined problem solving as making a search through what is known as problem space. And this problem space refers to all of the possible states in a problem. We'll look at a particular example of this in a minute. But you can think of it as any possible step or stage you could reach from the current state towards the goal state. So the problem space assumes that if we're solving a problem, we've got to somehow navigate our way through this problem space in order to find the ideal end solution or goal state that's there. So one position is the current state, one position is the goal state. And you can think of this very much like a sort of maze. So if you've got a kind of maze where you've got to start at one place and there's the middle of the maze is your goal, how are you going to navigate through those different stages to reach that central point? Is it just through trial and error, or are you going to use some sort of strategy? And they really emphasized that we could use two different strategies. One of these is algorithms. So an algorithm is a strategy that is guaranteed to find a solution. So it's a set of processes or steps that you can go through that is going to guarantee that you hit that goal solution. Alternatively, we can use heuristics. So these are rules of thumb, simple solutions and shortcuts that are going to be faster, they're going to be more efficient, and they'll likely lead you to an approximation or reasonable solution or close to the goal state, but they're not guaranteed to find a solution. So let's explore some of the differences between an algorithm and a heuristic with a particular example. So I want you to imagine that you are heading out on a night out and you're driving and you need to pick up 4 of your good friends, and these 4 friends all live at different locations around the city. So you live in one location, the place that you're going to is in another location on town, and you've got to pick up these 4 friends on the way. How do you go about deciding how to do that? In what order do you pick them up? Now, if we wanted to use an algorithm, this would give us the optimal solution. So we could calculate what is the combination or what order do we need to pick people up in that's going to result in the shortest length of time or the shortest distance that we need to travel. And you would do that using an algorithm by constructing a route map for all of the possible combinations. So we know if we've got 4 people to pick up, 4 factorial means that there's 24 different configurations or different orders that you could pick these people up. if you put all 24 of those configurations into Google Maps, and for each of them, it could then estimate what is the expected time. And then out of that, you would select the one that gives you the fastest route. Now that theoretically, we're excluding any external influences of kind of traffic, but that should theoretically give you the optimal solution. However, in reality, you know that is not what you do. You're not going to put in 24 different routes to see which one is going to be the fastest. Typically, you would use a heuristic. So you would use your general knowledge of the neighborhood and just estimate based on maybe this person, the first one you're going to pick up, this is the person that is the very closest to me. The last person you'll pick up is the person that is closest to the final destination. And then maybe midway through, you would just decide which of those other two friends do you feel like picking up first. So that would be a kind of very straightforward way of doing this. It's interesting that this problem is known as the traveling salesman problem. If you ever want to look this up, as it starts to get larger than 4, the computational issues of actually dealing with this through an algorithm get phenomenally complicated. So the algorithm that we've just described above, this is where we're considering every possible alternative is referred to as using an exhaustive search. So in other words, we're calculating every possible solution exhaustively and then selecting the one that is the most efficient. This works, this sort of algorithm approach is okay when our problem space is relatively small. However, when it starts becoming large, so when we've got a kind of complicated problem or there's a large search space, trying to use this algorithm approach just gets incredibly unwieldy. So the example before, where I've given you 4 people that you need to pick up, this sort of problem is also known as the traveling salesman problem, and is a really kind of thorny algorithm that becomes incredibly difficult to find a solution to. If you start increasing the number of people that you've got to visit above kind of 10, 20, 30 people, then trying to find an optimal solution for this using an algorithm is incredibly difficult. And another example might be if you're playing a game of chess. For the first move that you take, you've got 20 chess pieces. You've got 20 possible opening moves that you could use there. Maybe a little bit less. However, after that, in the next move, you have 400 moves. And then the next move after that, there's 7.5 million possible moves. And in the next stage, 225 million moves. So if you're trying to plan ahead and think through all of these possible solution or search spaces using an exhaustive search, this just seems a kind of impossible way to go about things. So certainly with human resources, it's not something we're likely to do. And even for computer chess programs that try and employ these algorithms, they don't perform as effectively as humans. So one of the things that was recognized by Newell and Simon is the fact that we have this limited ability to, as humans, to process and store information when we're trying to solve these complex problems. So rather than necessarily always using algorithms where we go through step-by-step processes and understand the entire solution space, instead we use heuristics. So we try and use actual little shortcuts that are simplified to try and help us solve these problems. So what are some of these different heuristics or problem-solving strategies? Well, one approach that we can use is known as a general heuristic called hill climbing. And you can think of this as the idea that we're taking steps each time with the intention of just trying to reduce the discrepancy between our current state and the goal state. So if you imagine that you want to move up a hill, so with the example that we've illustrated on here, we've got a robot that we've designed and we're instructing or trying to ask this robot to explore its environment and climb up a hill as far as possible until it reaches the peak. Now, if we wanted to instruct that robot how to do it, using a hill climbing technique would basically involve it telling it to make a calculation on each step and compare what's the current altitude and what would the altitude be if I take an additional step. And if it's going to increase my altitude, yes, we'll continue moving that way until you reach a point where taking a step would decrease your altitude. So a pretty simple strategy here, but it's basically focusing on the short-term goals. So you're constantly focused on reducing that discrepancy rather than necessarily focusing on what the final main goal is. And of course, as you can see on the figure, one of the limitations, or kind of serious problems with this, is that if we've got this uneven hill, then it's entirely possible that the robot, depending on where it starts, is going to find itself at the top of a smaller peak that is below the main peak. So in other words, you find yourself climbing up until you reach something that's known as a local maxima. So you might not be finding the optimal solution with this strategy or with this technique. We'll see another example of hill climbing in a minute. So in this regard, the hill climbing heuristic would mean that we're going to fail on any task where the solution to the problem requires us at any stage to work backwards. So if we need to kind of move towards the goal, and at one stage take a little bit of a step back, if we're constantly using this hill climbing strategy, we're going to come into problems. So for example, you can see on the clip that I showed you earlier, where we watched Limbo, there was a moment where we know that the goal is to move from the left to the right hand side of the screen, but there's a stage where you realize that we can't actually achieve this. We can't actually move from left to right. What we need to do in order to ultimately continue going from the left to the right and avoid one of the obstacles is to go backwards. It's to go up and to go around. So sometimes it's necessary to deviate from this hill climbing strategy. As another example, I want to have a look at a puzzle known as the Tower of Hanoi. This is known by other names as well. And in one version of the puzzle that I've illustrated on here, we're presented with an initial state where we have 3 discs of unequal size that are positioned on the far left peg. You have 3 pegs, and then our goal is basically to transfer all 3 of these discs from the left peg to the right peg, using the middle peg as a stationing area as needed. We have some operators, so we can think of these as givens, so some constraints of what we can do. And one instruction is that you can only move 1 disc at a time. A second instruction is you may never move a larger disc on top of the smaller disc. Now, in order to do this and in order to achieve this, if we wanted to use an algorithm, it would be really complicated because you would need to hold this entire problem space of all the possible locations and solutions of where this could be. And it just doesn't seem feasible that we can do this. So one of the ways that you can do this instead is to try and break down this problem into smaller bits and just considering one small part of the problem at a time. And Newell and Simon referred to this as using a means-end analysis. So when we're doing this, we break down this problem into several smaller, well-defined problems that we can understand a little bit easier. So using the Tower of Hanoi example, you've got this entire problem space involves moving a tower of discs from one peg to another peg. Now if we instead break this down into a lot of smaller sub-goals, one sub-goal is laying the foundation of the rightmost peg with the largest disc. So we know that we've got to get that largest disc over to the base level of the right hand side. And in order to do this, the first thing we've got to do is to solve 2 additional sub-goals. So we need to make sure that the rightmost peg is clear, that there's nothing else there obstructing it. And the problem solver also needs to make sure that the largest disk doesn't have anything on top of it. So we've got now 2 separate goals that we can start focusing on outside of our kind of main goal. And by breaking this down, we can end up actually being much more likely to come to a solution on these problems. We also find that means-end problem solving can also be really useful in solving a classic hobbits and orcs problem. So this is a problem that you've probably seen many different variants of, but it essentially involves you having to move a series of hobbits and orcs from one riverbank to the other, with the condition that you cannot leave the hobbits with an equal number of orcs that are on there. You have a boat to transfer them across, but the boat can only hold 2 creatures at one time. So whenever there's more orcs than hobbits on one side, the orcs are going to attack the hobbits. So you have a well-defined problem here with all of the parameters. Pause the video now and see if you can have a think about how you might solve that. So what stages would you go through to come up with a solution where everyone is on the other side of the riverbank? And if you want a hint, there are 12 steps involved in coming up to that final solution. Okay, good. So if you've had a go trying to solve that, how did you get on? This is 12 stages or 12 steps that you could have taken in order to achieve this goal. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I think one of the challenging aspects that come across for most people that are trying to solve this problem is when they get to the 4th step. So at that stage where you might have moved all of the orcs over to one side, you've got the hobbits on the other side, is that you're then faced with the problem that the orcs are essentially in the goal state. They're where you want them to be. Now with this problem you need to essentially work backwards, and you've got to realise that these orcs, yeah, we've got them in the goal state, but we need to take them out of that goal state in order to come up with or meet our eventual solution for this. So when you look at the time that people spend or where they make errors on this, step 4 to step 7, so when they've got to kind of work against or partially work backwards, is where participants tend to struggle on this the most. So to eventually you should find a solution where all of them reach on the right side.
Taking that internship in a remote mountain lab might not have been the best idea. Pulling that lever with the skull symbol just to see what it did probably wasn't so smart either. But now is not the time for regrets, because you need to get away from these mutant zombies fast. With you are the janitor, the lab assistant, and the old professor. You've gotten a head start, but there's only one way to safety: across an old road bridge spanning a massive gorge. You can dash across in a minute, while the lab assistant takes 2 minutes. The janitor is a bit slower and needs 5 minutes, and the professor takes a whole 10 minutes, holding onto the ropes every step of the way. By the professor's calculations, the zombies will catch up to you in just over 17 minutes, so you only have that much time to get everyone across and cut the ropes. Unfortunately, the bridge can only hold 2 people at a time. To make matters worse, it's so dark out that you can barely see, and the old lantern you grabbed on your way only illuminates a tiny area. Can you figure out a way to have everyone escape in time? Remember, no more than 2 people can cross the bridge together. Anyone crossing must either hold the lantern or stay right next to it, and any of you can safely wait in the dark on either side of the gorge. Most importantly, everyone must be safely across before the zombies arrive. Otherwise, the first zombie could step on the bridge while people are still on it. Finally, there are no tricks to use here. You can't swing across, use the bridge as a raft, or befriend the zombies.
Okay, so this is a good point for you guys to pause the video. So you've got a list of parameters here that we have a goal. You've got to get everyone across the bridge in 17 minutes. We've got some givens or some constraints that are in here. The bridge holds a maximum of 2 people at a time. Every crossing requires the lantern and people to be together. You, it takes 1 minute, lab assistant 2 minutes, Janza 5 minutes, professor 10 minutes. How are you going to do this? Have a think and then unpause the video when you're ready to find out.
At first it might seem like no matter what you do, you're just a minute or 2 short of time, but there is a way. The key is to minimize the time wasted by the 2 slowest people by having them cross together. And because you'll need to make a couple of return trips with the lantern, you'll want to have the fastest people available to do so. So, you and the lab assistant quickly run across with the lantern, though you have to slow down a bit to match her pace. After 2 minutes, both of you are across, and you, as the quickest, run back with the lantern. Only 3 minutes have passed. So far, so good. Now comes the hard part. The professor and the janitor take the lantern and cross together. This takes them 10 minutes, since the janitor has to slow down for the old professor, who keeps muttering that he probably shouldn't have given the zombies night vision. By the time they're across, there are only 4 minutes left, and you're still stuck on the wrong side of the bridge. But remember, the lab assistant has been waiting on the other side, and she's the second fastest of the group. So she grabs the lantern from the professor and runs back across to you. Now, with only 2 minutes left, the 2 of you make the final crossing. As you step on the far side of the gorge, you cut the ropes and collapse the bridge behind you, just in the nick of time. Maybe next summer you'll just stick to the library.
Okay, so this problem we've just seen is very similar to the hobbits and orcs problem, and certainly requires some element of us being able to work backwards from having moved people to the final goal state. So having moved people across the bridge, we have to move them back in order to come up with the final solution. And it's also the case that you find with this, a lot of people might make a common mistake of moving the people that are slowest over across the bridge earliest. However, you realize that in doing this is not going to lead to the ultimate proper, correct solution from this. So as another example of how breaking this down into little sub-goals or being able to work backwards is important in order to actually solve problems.